Hey everybody, welcome to Fat Product Review. So happy to see you here again. I've been taking a little bit of a break because I was a little bit sick, but I'm much better now. And I'm so excited to have Tigress with me here today. Tigress Osborn is the chair of the NAAFA, which is the National Association for the for the Advancement of Fat Acceptance. Lovely, amazing organization. If you don't know about it, please find them on all social media because they've been around for a long time, and Tigress is the chair now, and it's a new chapter for NAAFA. And yes, yay to fat liberation and fat acceptance. We need so much more of that. And we're going to talk about the B.M.I today. And if you're at all involved in fat world, fat politics, you know how much BS the B.M.I is. And I have this lovely human here who's going to help us understand and break it down why it is such bullshit. It is 200 years old. It was invented by a Belgian astronomer slash mathematician. Was not a doctor. I think his name is pronounced K. Ture, but yeah, 200 years old, the B.M.I, and it was never created to do what it's doing now. And essentially, as a formula, Tigress, it takes your weight and divides it by your height squared, something like that.
It's weight times height divided by 703. Something intuitive.
Very, yeah. And this was invented before the times of computers and calculators and things like that. So this was a thing that they were doing to why?
Well, I think to understand population trends, the creator was, I too will admit that I do not know the correct pronunciation of the creator's name. And one of the things I want to emphasize, so here's the thing for folks who are watching. If you, whether you know me, whether you know NAAFA, the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, whether you know anything about these topics at all, the bottom line is B.M.I is bullshit. We should be approaching people's health based on their individual medical history, not based on these sort of expansive ideas that have taken on meanings that they were never intended to have. And all of this is information that is well documented. You can Google right now problems with B.M.I. You'll find all kinds of articles about what is problematic about B.M.I. Everything from the way that it takes super muscular people and identifies them as obese to to the arbitrary classification of where the cutoff for obese was and how that can be changed, to the interpreting of B.M.I. as the most important thing in medicine when it fits the narrative of fat is bad, but then not the most important thing in medicine when it doesn't fit the narrative fat is bad. All of this is well documented. There are fat studies scholars, there are medical folks, there are statisticians, there are all kinds of people who are working on and have done work on what is problematic. There are social scientists who are analyzing the way B.M.I. and our understandings of B.M.I. are unfairly used against people of color or low-income people. Like, all of this stuff is out there. So whatever Crystal and I talk about today, there are folks who are even more expert than either of the two of us, right? I'm sort of, as the chair of NAAFA, a fat liberation history generalist, right? I want to be able to introduce people to some of the major points and the major discussion areas, and then I want to direct them to people who are much more knowledgeable than I am, and who spend their entire lives working on specific areas of these things. So the bottom line is, this is a taste test for y'all in understanding what's problematic about B.M.I. And then there's a boatload of resources that if you want to go deeper and if you want to have more evidence for when you're arguing with people or any of those kinds of things. I'm
gonna definitely share some of those in the show notes. And one of my favorite articles is from NPR, and the title is like the top 10 reasons why B.M.I. is bogus. From NPR. Okay, they use the word bogus and B.M.I. in the same title.
Well, and from NPR, because I think a lot of people, trolls, anti-fat trolls have this thing they call fat logic. And to them, fat logic is the things fat people say in order to justify staying fat, right? Yeah. And I think there are people, even well-meaning people, who think that a critical analysis of BMI is just about letting people off the hook for not wanting to lose weight. And it actually is not. there's critical analysis from a variety of resources, not just from people in the fat liberation or body positivity movements.
Yep.
So even if you're sort of skeptical, even if you think we have a bias, I do have a bias. I hate it.
Sure.
I think,
Yep.
I hate
Bullshit.
it. I think, yeah, it creates barriers in fat people's lives in a billion different ways, a bajillion different ways. And so I am biased. I'd like to see it
Eradicated.
yeah. Yeah. But even for folks who might have a more neutral beginning of their investigating of this, there are lots of resources that are from a wide variety of sources that will tell you some of the things that we've already pointed out and some of the other things that we'll talk about.
Yeah, and also, I don't know if people realize how racist the BMI can be. And then, as my fat friend said once in one of her articles, the 19th century was a boom time for racist science. And this is exactly when this was created. It was a boom time, lovely, for racist science. And he created all kinds of weird stuff like how to figure out who is the average man or the perfect man. And it's very bizarre. So it has a lot of racism involved in it as well.
In its foundation and in its application. So part of what happens is if you take one kind of human and you make them the standard bearer for all kinds of humans in any ways, physical ways, neurological ways, appearance ways, beauty standards, all the things, right? If you take this hugely diverse group of people, but then you make only one of them the standard bearer for what is quote unquote normal, then there's gonna be problematic interpretations of that. So even if this, you're this mathematician, you're just doing your like mathematician thing, and you're like, but I'm gonna base all of the things on these white guys that are here with me. Even if you didn't have malicious intent, even if you weren't intentionally being racist, the fact that you've made white men the norm is problematic in terms of people of all the other genders, and is problematic in terms of all of for the application to all the people who are not white, who may or may not have things in common physiologically.
I think he was kind of trying to prove his ridiculous theory that people of color are of another species, right? So like that's how ass backwards it is, right? Like has really shitty origins. And I don't know when people figured that was not true out, but I'm assuming it was around that time, hopefully. But I know for 200 years ago, people were still trying to prove that people of color were a different species. So that was created by the same person that was trying to prove that.
Well, there's a bunch of scientists trying to prove that, right? Like, I actually don't know specifically his like connections to eugenics or to race science. I know that what I know is that he intended for this to be used to study populations, not to study individual people's health. It was never meant to be applied that way.
Right.
But what I do know is that at that time, there's all kinds of science in play, in part, and I put science in quotation marks there, but what is accepted by some people of the time as science, and unfortunately what is still accepted by some white supremacists as science, there's a historical need in order to justify the economic benefits, like everything we're getting from slavery, and we need to keep doing that in all the places where that is happening. We're in all the places where slavery is white people enslaving African humans, right? We've enslaved these African humans and we've brought them to where we are to do labor. And then, then we've raped them. So a bunch of their offspring don't look like they they looked. So as you have a few generations of that and populations of enslaved people become more mixed in terms of varied skin tones, then we also need other things to justify why they are different than us, because now they look more like us and we still want to keep them as property. Still want to keep them as property. So what are the other things we might look at in order to help us categorize them? And body size becomes one of those things, right? And at the same time, there's this sort of temperance movement in Christianity that that has people believing that the way to be closer to God or more godlike is to control your human urges. And those should be your sexual urges, and they should be your other urges towards pleasure, like eating. So you got to tighten up and really just, only eat what's absolutely necessary, and you've got to be pious, and all of these things sort
Yeah.
of become woven together. And so, the BMI debuts in a time when that's the setting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we owe a lot of our I think we owe a lot of our contemporary understanding of this to the work of Dr. Sabrina Strings at the University of California, Irvine, who has written this incredible text, Fearing the Black Body: The Racist Origins of Fat Phobia. And and Dr. Strings examines all of these ideas about how fatness becomes uh, you know defines an unruly body and then becomes connected to blackness intentionally in order to separate whiteness from blackness with yet another, like yet another forced social constructed um
Right.
separation, right?
Yeah.
Race is socially constructed. I spent many years of my professional career as a diversity educator working with high school students. And one of the things we used to talk about all the time is that, race is socially constructed. If you look at the science of what we think, like, you can just look at people and put them in racial categories. If you look at people on a DNA level,
Yeah.
there are people who you think of as different races who have more in common on a DNA level than
Mhm.
they have in common with other people who you think of them as being in the same races. And so, and skin color stuff has a lot more to do with, I mean, before you factor in things like uh, people mingling across cultural groups, it has to do with your proximity to the equator. It doesn't have to do with your
Yep.
moral anything or superior
Right.
anything.
Yep.
And and again, like, there are people way more expert than me that you can look to for more information about the social construction of race. But if you understand that race is a socially constructed category, and fatness is a socially constructed category where we start to call people fat, who gets defined as fat versus, who gets defined as still socially acceptable,
Right.
changes also in context, right? Because it's a
Mhm.
social construction. And so once you understand that, then when you think about how the two work together, how race and fatness get constructed in ways that, that hold each other up, um,
Mhm.
and thus hold other people down.
Right.
um, and Dr. String's work is, it's a scholarly work, right? Like, it's almost a
Mhm.
textbook, but
Yep.
it's become so popular because it really speaks to what we already kind of know.
Yeah.
We know that there is racism all throughout fat phobia. We hear it in the way people talk about black bodies, especially, but other people of color, spicy Latinas, curvy, whatever. Like, we hear it, right? We hear
Yeah.
connections all the time in our current lives between race and fat,
Mhm.
and the fear of being fat, or what's appropriately, like, what's an appropriate amount of fat in different cultures. We hear it all the time. But I
Mhm.
think, having that scholarly work to help us really understand more of the history of it has really shifted some conversations for folks.
I'll
And I
definitely
think,
include her links and stuff and her book in my show notes as well because you're right. She's very important to all of this, and there's
and I
so much to read and take in and learn about
Yeah,
BMI
and the
and
book
about.
is, like I said, it's an academic book. Not all of us. It's not like your beach reading book, but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
worth it. And also, Dr. Strings has been in all kinds of media, including, she's been on the NAAFA webinar with. I've
Right.
interviewed her, and she's accessible. Like, when you talk to her, you'll get it. You don't have to be,
No.
like, thank God for the fat studies nerds, right? But, like, you
Yeah.
don't have to be a fat studies nerd. Like, this information is accessible to you, and there are lots of folks writing about it, particularly Black women journalists and bloggers who are who are writing about these same concepts and weaving in their own personal experiences with these things in their family histories and in their current lives. And so, there are other things that you can read about the connections between how anti-fatness shapes our lives.
Mhm.
Leah Vernon's book about being fat, Black, and Muslim, Dr. Joy Cox's book. I know you had her on this show
Yeah.
already,
Hmm.
about fat girls and Black bodies. Like, lots of people are talking about this now, but still not enough people are talking about
Not enough. Definitely
it.
not. No. And that people get confused, I think, about BMI. If I think about BMI, like just taking a real, like, personal level, my weight and my height says nothing about me and my body and my health and
Mhm.
my abilities and like it's the how is it still being used today? I don't understand. People know it's just fluff and they still use it in modern medicine.
I think a lot of people don't know it's just fluff, because I think we live in a culture where a lot of people accept the advice of the medical establishment as fact. And so if the medical establishment is mostly still using it, even if there are people within that establishment that are critiquing it, we know that the medical establishment does not always listen to voices of critique from their own community,
True.
because when the American Medical Association classified obesity as a disease, their own internal committee on whether to do that or not advised them not to. And
Yeah,
then
I
they
remember.
voted to do it anyway. So we know that people's, like, sort of like, everybody knows understanding of fat also gets played out in the medical establishment, that there are people who in theory are reliant on information and facts and critical analysis, but in practice are still led by some of their biases and their own internalized fat phobia, and their
Hmm.
just that sense of, like, well, this is common knowledge, so it must be true. And I think that a lot of people are still relying on that when they hear, about the BMI. And when you hear that changing your BMI can dramatically increase your health profile. Like, think about this. One of the things that's most commonly given as medical advice for why a person should lose weight is that a 10% decrease in your BMI will change your overall health profile. And
Right.
that's just stated as a fact. But how could 10% of a person with 300-pound body weight dramatically change their health profile? And then if they walk into another, into, so 10% of that would be, right, like about 30 pounds, right? Then you walk
Mhm.
into a different doctor's office at 270 pounds and they tell you, if you lose 10% of your body weight, it
Right.
would dramatically change. But that's not how numbers work. You can't just keep 10%ing it, from a different starting place everywhere you go and have that be universally true, right? But it sounds
Hmm.
true. It
Hmm.
sounds like, oh, I can make this little change and it'll make this dramatic, change in my health. And it may or may not. And it may be the
Hmm.
things that you're doing to try to make that change that are making the dramatic difference in your health, and
Right.
that's the change
Yeah.
itself, right?
Yeah.
Um, but
The,
you go ahead, sorry.
the first time I ever really got hit upside my head with the BMI being thrown at me was when I was trying to get life insurance about 15 years ago. And, you know, I'm in good health. Like everything is, all my numbers are good, except that number on my scale. The people that came to my house that did they took my pee, they took my blood, everything. But then when they turned it all in and they showed my actual weight, they said, no, you can't have life insurance. I was like, you
Uh,
freaking kidding me? I
And
mean, I'm
that
not on any medications. Just all based on the number. That was it.
well, and that's not just 15 years ago. I had that experience 6 months ago.
I remember, yeah.
We have a volunteer at NAAFA who's working on actually putting together a database of life insurance companies that don't have that automatic BMI cutoff. But BMI cutoffs are applied arbitrarily to all kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
If there are you can't receive. We were just doing some work. We're just doing some work in the last couple of days about um, some anti-discrimination law work that's being done in Michigan, and around organ transplants. And, like, one of the things that our good friends at FLAIR, which is the Fat Legal Advocacy and Rights Education Project, they point out that even people who have no other medical reason why we believe that a transplant would not be viable, and have a private donor who is willing to give them an organ, will be prohibited from having the surgery because of their BMI.
Yep.
So everything about their medical tests say they're a great candidate for this.
Yep.
And they've got the part. They don't have to go on a transplant list or wait for they've got it. And they still can't have the surgery just based on that number.
I
You know,
tried to give bone marrow once, and they said no, just based on my weight. And I was like, "What? Why can't you have my BMI? Why can't you have my bone marrow?" They said, "Oh, just the BMI won't allow it." I'm like,
well, and
"That's ridiculous."
I think some people, especially people who've never thought a lot about the specifics of BMI or never learned anything about the history of it, think that BMI is actually the improvement over only
Mhm.
looking at the number on the scale or looking at those old like insurance charts. Because it's not just
Actuaries.
your height and weight. You also do some other math, right? That must mean it's a
Mhm.
calculation that somebody's really figured out.
Right.
Yeah, and they
No.
figured out something. They figured out one
Mhm.
particular thing. But
Sure.
to paraphrase what Marilyn Wan says this about weight, activist Marilyn Wan says this about weight, I think it's also really true of BMI is like the only thing you can tell, the only thing you can diagnose just based on that number is your amount of prejudice based on that number, right?
Exactly.
And then when you connect that with other kinds of prejudice, BMI's main setting, when we think about other access issues for fat people, things like, do they have chairs for me and things like that. But
Yeah.
they don't have to know your BMI for those things to be relevant, right? Um, but like whether you can, like what you do with seats on a plane doesn't necessarily have to do with your BMI, but everything you have to do in the medical world does. It can prevent you
Yeah.
from being eligible for anesthesia. It can prevent you from being eligible
Mhm.
for surgery. And if we know that research shows us that medical professionals often view fat patients as non-compliant or unwilling to, lazy, not willing to go through the steps that they need to go through. So then you double that up with
Yep.
people who are already subjected to those kinds of stereotypes based on their weight, on their race. And so then you have an even more disproportionate effect of BMI prejudice on
Yeah.
Black and brown people who are already dealing with medical bias. And and we know that especially in Black and Latinx communities,
Mhm.
um, there's a higher prevalence of higher weight. Some of that
Mhm.
is body type, some of that is other social conditions. Like there's a whole complicated
Yeah.
bunch of
Yeah.
reasons. And also, in some ways, those reasons matter because they're connected to other social justice issues. In some ways, they don't matter because we just live in the bodies we have, right? My colleague Darlene Howell and I went to we sat through this like 3.5 hour workshop on childhood obesity because we wanted to hear what some of these experts were saying about childhood obesity. And at the end, I asked a question to the last person who had presented about whether we are factoring in anything about differences, cultural differences, economic
Socioeconomic
differences,
differences.
so all of those things when it comes to Black and brown communities. Not only did he not answer the question, he forgot his camera was on and he's just checking his email. He said, like, that's how unimportant it was for him to consider this question about the most marginalized communities and the way this other marginalization is affecting them.
Right.
The other thing that I think is really interesting about race and BMI is let's say you believe BMI science, right? Let's say you believe that it's solid and we just have to apply it and that's what it is. And then you start to study East Asian folks and you discover that they have some of the same diseases as people in higher BMI categories, even though as a group they tend to be in lower BMI categories.
Yeah.
One would think that that would make you question whether
You
BMI
would.
is really the connection.
Right.
Instead, what happens is you create a category called thin obesity.
Yes, I read
So
about that.
that you can so that you can continue to say that these diseases are obesity related, even though now
Right.
you are studying a population of people who are not fat. And I should say here, like, I'm saying obesity in quotation marks in
Right.
fat liberation activism. There are a lot of folks who just won't even say those words because of the
Yeah.
way they pathologize us. I tend
Right.
to use them when I'm talking in context, but I don't use them in other ways. But I should have probably trigger warned that for people who don't like those words. But I mean, the bottom line is there are all these connections between, race and body stuff and the way that those prejudices intersect and and create access issues and civil rights issues, and quality of life issues for fat people. So if you're fat, BMI is messed up enough. If you're fat and something else that the medical establishment already has problems with, then it's even a double whammy.
You're going to
And
get shittier care. We know that for sure. I
yeah,
know you have to go to your next interview, but I just want to end with one thing. No matter what your BMI is, if you want to have weight loss surgery, you're in.
isn't
Somehow
that isn't
it's
that
weird.
interesting? And I
Yeah,
think And I think their justification is, well, you being fat might kill you anyway. So what if so what if this surgery kills you, right?
We
There's a
can make an exception for
lot of
that, I noticed.
complicated stuff to talk about the way weight loss surgery, or as some people in activist community call it, stomach amputation, the way that that is prescribed, the way that it's administered, the way it's followed up on. There's all kinds of problematic stuff to talk about there.
Yeah.
Um, and think about people needing other life-saving surgeries and being denied them, but that because of their BMI, but then being told that it's absolutely fine to have this one.
Right.
Um, and having it sold to them as life-saving when the jury's still out on that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it comes with a
So
lot of complications. And then, when I had my hysterectomy last December, it was sort of urgent, and I kept waiting for the anesthesiologist to say, "We can't do it." And then she came in to talk with me, and I was like waiting for her to have the discussion with me about my weight, not one thing. I'm like, and she goes to leave. I go, "Wait, you don't want to talk about my weight at all?" She's like, "No, we're doing this in an hour." I'm like, interesting. They never came up, but it was urgent because I had a little cancer. So they just, rushed me through. But I was like, isn't that interesting? If I went to them to get my knee replaced, they would be like, "Well, you're going to have to go on a diet, or have weight loss surgery." I don't know. It was weird. They seem to pick and choose when it's convenient for them, which is
they
not
they do
convenient for most of us.
they do pick and choose, and sometimes it's the actual surgeon's bias, sometimes it's the anesthesiologist lack of training, sometimes it is the insurance company or the surgeon's malpractice company. Like, there's all these different
Yeah,
factors. You can
yeah.
have people, and in this especially, I in one more area where this really affects people who are marginalized in their bodies in other ways, for transgender and non-binary
Oh,
folks who want to have gender affirming surgery,
yeah.
if they're being turned down for that because of their BMI, and sometimes they're being turned down for that even though they've found a surgeon who will do it, because the surgery center where that person works
Right.
doesn't accept people over a certain BMI, or the
Yeah.
hospital where that person works has different cutoffs. And so you can't even go into this universally understanding how this really problematic tool will be used against you,
Nope.
because it's arbitrarily applied.
Fully.
And it's random. And what that means is, even if it were an effective tool, we would not be able to know how to use it effectively,
Right.
and the establishment doesn't care about that enough because of the
Huh.
population of people who it is. And that is
True.
that all just boils down to anti-fatness.
Yep. Totally. And I should say I'm white, so maybe it would have been different if it was a Black woman that needed to have this urgent surgery. Who knows? I hope not, but it's possible.
Yeah, or if you were a white trans man who had a uterus, or like all of the things, right? Like, yeah,
Hmm.
all of our privileges help us navigate these things, but wouldn't it be better if we just got rid of these destructive things, so that not
Oh,
only the people
yes.
with privileges, you know,
It
didn't
would
have
be.
to navigate this nonsense?
It would be. Thank you, Tigress. I appreciate it. I know we could probably do this for an hour or more, or 2 hours. And there's so much to discuss around BMI. And then, yeah, when you intersect BMI with people's color of their skin or any other, you know, things, it just gets so ugly and so sad. And it just sucks. It pisses me off. And I know it pisses you off too. And it's just unfair.
Yeah, but the bottom line, I mean, the short piece is BMI is bullshit, and so let's continue to advocate against it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tigress. I will definitely share the NAAFA links and all that good stuff. And your interview with Sabrina, Dr. Strings, was amazing. So we'll put that in the show notes too.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for your support. Happy Fat Liberation Month, everybody.
Yeah, same to you. Thanks. Bye.